In this video, we're going to look at how we start to connect the user interface to the database tables that you made at the beginning of your project work. And so you can see I'm going to start here with my login screen, and we're going to kind of do this one screen at a time. So this video will entirely focus on this login screen, and you can sort of see directly how this screen will connect to the data and how we get and retrieve the data and use that data to make decisions. So before we get started on that code, I just want you to look. I'm in the data section of my project, and you can see I've got my tables here already made. And so in the customer login, the user is going to provide a username and their password, and they're going to try to log in. Now, I want to be able to validate, is this person a valid user or not? Do they have the right password? If those things aren't true, then they can't be accessing the data for the orders or place a new order. And so I need some way to evaluate that. And the way I'm going to do that is to use my customers table. And so real quick, I'm going to look at my customers table and see what's inside it, right? I've got a last name, a first name, email address, username, and password. But I don't have any actual customers. So nobody's going to be able to log in to use this. So I better make a new customer just for testing purposes, and I'll just make myself because that's convenient. And I'll enter all the information that's pertinent. And my username, I'll just make that this, and I'll just make my password. Worst password ever, but we'll do it. Add a row, okay? Now, in this way, what I've done is I've pre-populated my database with some information here. Many of you will want to do this if you have users that you know ahead of time are the ones that are supposed to be able to access your system. You'll pre-populate your user database tables with the information that applies to those users. So I'm going to leave that as it is for now. I've got one user and all that information set up. And so now what I want to do is allow me, in this case, to enter my information, log in, and have that either do the right thing or tell me I'm wrong, right? So we're going to go over to the code now. And I don't have any code in here. But what I want you to do as you're working is to keep yourself organized. It's going to make life a lot easier for you. And so I'm going to do things by screen. I recommend that you kind of do them by screen as well. As a matter of fact, in order to start, I'm going to write a comment. A comment is just a bit of code that the computer ignores entirely. It's just for human eyes. So the way we start a comment, a one-line comment in JavaScript, is with a double /. So I'm just going to write that this is login screen code, right? So this is for my login screen. Now, most of the code that you write, almost all of it, will be response to events. And when we say events, we're talking about things that the user does, right? Typing into a field or clicking a button, right? Now, the only thing we really want to respond to in this screen is the clicking of the login button. And so the way we respond to events is to use the onEvent function here, which you can see is the first one in the user interface controls area of your toolbox. So again, you can either drag that, right, as a block. I prefer to type, so you'll see me typing a lot more. But you'll see the first thing that we need to do is provide an ID. What is that referring to? It's asking what item on the screen are we listening for an event for or responding for an event for. And so, well, in my case, I want to respond to the login button. Well, I don't know. What's the ID for that? I need to come back to my design tab, click on that button, and see what the button's called. Oh, it's called button 1. That's a terrible name for a button because I don't know what button 1 is, right? I'm going to rename that to login button. And again, I suggest that you also have a naming scheme of some kind that makes it obvious for you to know what things are. So I'm going to call that login button. I feel a lot better about that. Great. I come back to the code. My ID is, in quotes, literally that name, login button. If I hadn't changed it, it would have been button 1, right? Okay, so I'm responding to the login button. What event do I want to respond to? Well, I do want to respond to a click, but you can respond to all different kinds of events, like key presses or mouse movements or all those kinds of things. But for buttons, typically it's a click that you're going to want to respond to, and so I'm going to leave that as click. This next part is the confusing part, but it's not really that confusing once you see what's going on. The first two things are saying, what item on the screen are we paying attention to? The login button. What are we what event are we paying attention to? A click of that button. The last thing is, what are we going to do about it? And so what we're doing is defining what's called a callback function. And this is a function that gets called by this event when this thing happens. So when someone clicks the login button, what is supposed to happen? Well, this is supposed to happen. Right now, there's nothing in it. So we're defining a function that accepts as a parameter an event. The event is the click itself. We won't typically use the event for anything, but it's information about where the button was clicked and that kind of thing. So everything between these curly braces that you see here and here is what happens in response to the click. Okay? And that's what we want to focus on here, and this is where you're going to see how it connects to the database code. Okay? So first thing I want to do is get the information that they typed into these fields, right, and store that as some kind of variable. So whenever you want to store a variable, you make a new variable and use var to declare that variable. I want a username variable to take what's in here, so I could call that username or uname or un or whatever you want to call it. I'm just going to call it user, okay? And I want that to equal whatever it is they typed, okay? Well, what they typed is in this field. So I need to know what this field is called. All right, I don't know what this field is called. I don't remember. I just kind of built it in the design portion. So come back to the design tab, click on it, and you'll see, oh, it's called text input 1. Again, terrible name. I don't know what text input 1 is. I'm going to call that username underscore TI for text input. Okay, I'm going to rename that. Great, username TI. Okay, so I want to get the text from that text field. Well, if you look and you want to pay attention, we're dealing with the user interface, so we're looking at the user interface controls. That's why I have this up here. You can see there are a lot of functions available to you. And you know, it might be hard to remember, but it's nice that this list is here because you can, if you're trying to figure out something, you can look through the list and determine, is there something that seems to make sense for what you're trying to do? I'm trying to get what they typed into this text field. Oh, I see. Oh, look at this, a get text, right? I can see, is that what I want? Get the text from the specified element. Yeah, that sounds like the right thing. So I want get text, and I want to give it the ID, right? Now, I said this was username TI. Oh, there it is, right? I could have just typed it, or I can click it. I want to do the same thing for the password. So var pass, let's say. I want to get the text from the password text field. But again, I don't know what that's named. I probably didn't name that right when I first started. Indeed, I didn't. It's called text input 2. Let's call that password underscore TI. Come back here, password underscore TI. Don't forget your semicolons. Great. I have the information from the screen here, and I can even, if I want to check things, a good thing to do is use a console. So console.log will basically put information down here into the debug console whenever you run, so you can check to make sure things are doing what you expect. So I might say something like user typed the username and the password. So put a space in between. Plus means concatenate, which means put strings together, right? So I can see if this is doing what I expect. I can actually run this right now. I have a full-on event handler for this login button, and we can see what happens. So let's do it, see what we get. So I run this, I type Joe, password is 12345, and I try to log in. Look at that. In the console, I see it says user type Joe12345, so I know I'm successfully retrieving the information from these two widgets, these two text inputs. Great. Now, the next thing I want to do is check against my database, is that a valid user, right? And if it is, I want to be able to respond to that in an appropriate way. And if it's not, same thing, I want to do something appropriate, right? So now is the part where we start to deal with the database, and we want to be able to get information from, in this case, the customers table, right? So the way that we do that is we jump over to the data portion of the toolbox, and we can see it's a pretty limited set of things that we can do. I want to read a record. Okay? I want to read the records from, well, what table? Not my table. What's the name of the table? Well, the name of my table is customers. Okay? So you want to be able to pay attention to the tables you made. The first thing we're looking for is the name of the table that we're interested in this case, customers. Okay? That needs to be in quotes, and it needs to be exactly as it is, right? So what I mean by that is, I think it's case sensitive, so you have capital C, capital C. I tend to not want to put spaces. You'll see me use underscores a lot. I don't like to have spaces in the names of things because that can throw things off. So watch out for that. All right. I want to read the records, okay? But I don't want to get all the customers. I just want to know if this username and password is a customer, right? So how do I retrieve the single customer with this username and password? Well, what I want to do is in here, if you look here, it will help you. It's always a good idea to check the examples. It kind of tells you how this works and what you should do. The second parameter here is the terms. Terms are how we specify which types of, or which data we want from the table. So you can kind of come down and check. Let's find a good one here. They always have a lot of good examples here. So for instance here they're trying to read records from a favorite foods table where the age of apparently a person is whatever the driving age is, right? So this is the term. So we're saying, actually let me just do it with mine, it'll be a little bit more clear. I want to get the customer whose username is what was typed, okay? Well, in my customer table, I've got a username attribute, a username field. So what I want to do is say, give me the customer whose username is, okay, now this username is referring to this name here. Those two things are matching up. Okay, so whose username in this column is the username that they typed. Well, where did we store the username that they typed? In this user variable. So I want the customer whose username is user. Not only that, I also want to make sure that they typed the correct password. So I want the customer whose password is the password they typed. Now again, this password I'm taking directly from this column name. Okay. I want the user whose password is what they typed as well. Great. So this is automatically populated code, and it's going through all of the, again, this is a function that executes once these records are read. So we get from the customers table all of the customers with this username and this password. There should only be one. There should only be one with that username and password, typically, right? You can't have more than one username in the same system because how do you know who it is? So there's only going to be one, but once it retrieves that record, it's going to pass that set of records, which again, there's only going to be one in this case, but there could be more in other cases, into this function. And then what's going to happen is this is going to run on that set of records. Now this, what this is saying, you might not want to do this. I don't want to do this. This is what it automatically does when you pass that in. That's why I don't really like to use the drags. I like to just type this, right? What do I want to do here? Well, again, I can kind of see console. I could say something like, if the length of the records, if the number of records is 0, that means there was no user name and password that matched. So I'm going to use a conditional here and say if records, now records is an array. Okay, what's being returned back from read records is an array, a list of records that match this condition. Okay, if there are no records that match this condition, that means they typed a wrong username and password. So if the length of that array, which we get by saying .length, is 0, we Use triple equals to test for that. Then that's a bad username and password. So I could like console.log bad username password. Otherwise, right, it was a good username and password. So I could say console.log found user, and I could even say something like records. Now since that's an array, I can get the first item in that array using square brackets. You might remember this from what we did earlier in the year. And then I can access any attribute from that record using its column name. So I'll print first and last name. How's that? So user, found user, record sub-0, meaning the first record, plus a space, plus records sub-0 dot last name, should not be in quotes. And I can see now if this is working as it should. Okay. So right now all I'm doing is logging to the console whether or not this worked or not. So let's run this and see what happens. I'm going to reset. I'll run it. If I type Joe and 12345, well, that person's not in my database. So it should tell me this is what the user typed and it's a bad username and password. Great. Let's try it again with what I actually put in there. So I put my username, my password was password. Well, let's just leave it as 12345. Log in. This should not work again because the password's wrong. Good. User typed Smiller 12345, bad username, password. Okay, but the real password was password. Let's try that. Log in. Hey, look at that. User typed Smiller password, found user, Steve Miller. It was accessing from the database that information. So it's directly pulling from that database. And that's where the power is in what you've done to set up earlier when you created your database. Okay, so there's a lot going on here. You want to take a look. You want to ask me questions as you're going through the video if something doesn't make sense, if you don't really remember about how arrays work, for instance, or you're unsure about how these terms are working. Please ask questions because you're going to be doing this a lot, and so you want to make sure you understand it. Okay? All right, great. So far this seems to be working pretty well, but it's not doing what I want. I want to be able to move, once they hit login, I want them to be able to like move into the screen where they can make an order, that kind of thing. So I need to and if they type the wrong thing, I want that to show up. So let's add that code, right? If they type a bad username and password, I want this kind of hidden label to pop up so that they see that, right? So how can that work? Well, that's a user interface element. So let's look through the list here and see if anything pops up at us and that kind of tells us show element. That sounds promising. This is hidden. There's a function called show element. So if we use that, I need to give it, again, the ID of the thing that I want to show up. Well, again, I don't remember what that thing's called. Called label 4. All right, that's a terrible name. But, go away. But we'll use it. We'll say label 4. Now if I run this, I type something that's not in the database. Look at that. It responds by popping this up, okay, and give me the opportunity to then type something correct, okay? Now, if I type something correct, well, what do I want to have happen? I want to be able to move from this screen to my activity screen, which right now doesn't have anything in it because we didn't do that yet. But let's make that happen nonetheless. So if they type a correct username, then I want to be able to set the screen, and you can actually see, right, it's on the list here. There's a set screen function. I don't see it, but it's there. It's at the bottom, where I can actually change which screen I'm on from a command, right? And so now, if I run this, and I type a correct, let's say I misspell. That's a good idea. I try to log in, it tells me it's wrong. Spell it correctly. Try to log in, takes me to the next screen. Okay? And so now we've got this validation of the user, and we can continue to move on. Okay? Big ideas here, though. How we're connecting the user interface that we've made to the data that we made prior in a way that causes good things to happen, okay, through the code. This is basically all we need to do for my login screen, okay? And then if we could progress now to the activity screen and start to write the code for that as well. Of course, I have to actually create the widgets on the activity screen to do the things that I want to do, but we would then work on that screen and just sort of progress through. That way you're doing things in bite-sized chunks, you're keeping things organized so you don't get lost and you know where everything is. It's a really good way to work, okay? So hopefully that made sense. I'll have additional videos dealing with some of the other screens because there's a lot more nuance about creating records, deleting records, and reading records and stuff like that. So look for more videos about that. But this should get you started thinking about at least the initial passes at accessing data and interacting with that data on your user interface.